Welcome to the first Coffee with Dr. Natalie. It's a new version of my masterclasses. I'll outline kind of what we're going to do today. I'm going to do 2 of these in August. That won't always be the case. I think usually I'm only going to do 1 masterclass that's free a month. For now, I have 2 this month because I had a big subject matter that I really wanted to pile into. So this is really geared for women in midlife. Depends on the literature you review, but that could be anybody from age 35. I know, cringy, up to age 65. That's a big group of people. But there's a lot of factors that go into that. So midlife really isn't about age set so much as it's about, are you in that place in your life where your roles are changing significantly? And some of us had kids earlier. And so 35, you might have teenagers in your house and kids aging out. Some of us did not have kids. And so you might be at that stage in your career where you're like, this sucks. And I'm looking for a major change, which is kind of a midlife thing to do. For some of us, it was a combination of that, or maybe it's the dissolution of a relationship that we had for a long period of time. So midlife is really defined by if what you had been doing up until this point is going to have some big changes going forward, then you may be in that midlife transition-y kind of way. And anything that I teach about is useful for anybody that's going through any kind of major change process. So these are skill sets that I teach. I teach them to students. I teach them to my clients in my individual therapy practice. And I've taught them now through group coaching and online in the Learn to Love Your Story format. But it's all stuff that's useful for anybody, honestly. So that being said, there's 8 kind of major, it depends on the literature that you review, but there's like 8 major areas of kind of similarities in the experience of transition that women have at this stage. We're going to go through 4 today, and we'll go through the other 4 on the 27th of August. So feel free to join us again. It'll be a similar conversation, but a little bit different subject matter and the second set. So today, as we go through those 4, like I said, it's just a relaxed Saturday morning. So I'll probably talk about a subject, and then I'll see if anybody on the chat wants to throw in some questions that are more specific around that area. And if not, feel free to join if you're somebody that, is okay putting your face out there, or at least unmuting so that you can share your question with us that way. Please do. Again, this is intimate. This is supposed to be more
because I pre-recorded, I will not be able to show you the parts where other participants joined in, but I'll do my best to highlight the questions that they were asking so that you understand the subject matter.
So feel free to use the chat if that's how you want to do it. I've got it up and I should be able to see that throughout. Okay, so let's jump in. The 4 areas that we're going to talk about today, I've already kind of alluded to one. Number 1 is obviously big change. It's kind of how the definition works. So it's what we're wrapping ourselves around. So this is kind of the first area that we'll just talk a little bit more about. But from big changes, there's also kind of a set of things that can happen that everybody experiences going through something like that. So the first feeling is a feeling of insecurity, and it's pretty pervasive, meaning it's really difficult to push past. It's really difficult for people to just say, oh, I know I'm insecure because I'm going through a change. I noticed that and I can move on from that. It's sometimes very debilitating how insecure we can get in these big changes. We'll talk a little bit about that. Then there is this next set of things that happen, and that is that you start to feel a little bit empty about where your life is. So here we are, big change, feeling insecure. Then it starts to set in that we're feeling a little empty about where life is at. And the 4th thing we'll talk about is this lack of fulfillment that then arises from that combination or cascade of things. So big change. And you can put this in the chat as we talk. Who wants to share any kind of big changes that they're noticing in midlife? I can tell you for myself, as a woman in midlife, I'm a twice divorced woman. I have 2 children and I'm a single parent. Obviously, divorce was one of the bigger midlife transitions that I did. That's definitely a big change that I went through. But I would say actually ones that are the most prominent for me right now are work related by choice. Some things that I just wanted to kind of jazz up my work life. So Learn to Love Your Story was born from that, was looking for some more creativity in my life. And also the fact that I have kids that are about 11 and a half years apart, 10 and a half years, 11 and a half years apart. That's always kind of wiggy. And I've got one that's adulting, as they say. He's adulting now. So still living in the house with his dad, but going off to college, starting the things, pretty much self-sufficient, that kind of stuff. So that's also one of those big changes. And what happens when we have these big changes in our life is that insecurity starts to slip in. What are we supposed to do? It's like, we didn't get like a plan of here's how you do this, right? And what's more, culturally, we have this kind of social conditioning that we should do really, really well, like 100% really, really well. Perfectionism, anybody? Is that something that you run up against? Because if you do, this insecurity and big change piece is where that's going to kind of blow up in your face, right? So for anybody that, has been through something like this, is on the precipice of going through something like this, has done this in the past, feel free in the chat to share any questions that you might have about ways that you can go through this. But I have an acronym that I'm using now. I haven't put a lot of stuff out on this yet, but my new acronym for us to kind of remember the different steps that I think are useful during all of these kinds of transitions is PLACES. Okay, so the acronym is PLACES, PLACES, personalized liberation through awareness, compassion, empowerment, and self-care. So I'll say that again. It's personalized liberation through awareness, compassion, empowerment. And I have a very specific idea of what all four of those mean. Obviously, I've set up online courses about it. I coach on these subjects, but I would say in the big changes in security combination, what will help you the most is to have that compassion piece. So for those of you who haven't heard me speak on the idea of compassion, self-compassion is about being kind, understanding, and even loving towards yourself. So that learn to love your story. The love in that is really about getting at this being kind, understanding, having the lens of, oh, I can see why I needed to do that when I did that. It looks like one of you said that you have the last one entering into the senior year of high school and one adulting. Yep. Mm-hmm. That's a major transition, right? Like you've been parenting for 20 or more years, right? Somewhere in that range. And so your whole life, that's a huge change. And if you didn't have insecurity, honestly, I'd be surprised, right? It's just how these two things match up. But compassion is really useful at a time like this because we're holding ourselves accountable to a really high standard. We're comparing ourselves to everybody else, which is something that we do culturally and socially. And almost all Western cultures, I would say, have a real emphasis on, am I doing as well as the person next to me? Or am I doing as well as the ideal is for a woman my age or going through a transition like this? And when you're doing that, that's judgment. It's getting self-judgmental. I like it to call it the inner mean girl. This is how culture's ideas for us start to get embedded in who and how we think of ourselves. And so then we start to self-judge. And that is a not useful thing to do in this moment. And in fact, is what leads into the third thing, which is feeling empty. So let's sit and chat a little bit. Any questions that you have about this idea of self-compassion or compassion in general? I'd be happy to answer any. I'm going to sip some coffee.
There was a question posed by one of the participants about how to show yourself self-compassion when that was never an example as a child.
So there's a couple ways to do this. One is traditionally find examples of it in your life or out in the public eye. So two authors that you could look at, or thought leaders, I don't know. Glennon Doyle is one, and her book Untamed really kind of walks through personally liberating herself. And she does get at pieces in there where she talks about how to use compassion. Another person is Jen Hatmaker. Also really, some of the stuff that she's putting out now in her podcast For the Love, and once she's guested on, I think she's talking a lot about the breakup of her marriage and how that really highlighted for her this codependent tendency she had to shield herself by just denying that anything was happening. Like, oh, no, got it all together. Perfect over here. I got this going. Those are two white women in their midlife. I am working on finding a little bit more BIPOC diversity in some of those examples, and don't have them right now, but I certainly will post when I do, anytime I find stuff like that. Austin Channing Brown is definitely one of my favorite Black authors. However, she's a good 15, 20 years younger than I am. So she's in a different stage in her life. So I wouldn't say that she would necessarily have information relevant to the life change aspect of that, but she certainly does speak to the use of compassion in her work on anti-racism for certain. All right. So there's that. But here's a clinical trick that I do teach about in my courses and in lots of different respects. Women are really great at having compassion for other people, like superpower great at having compassion for other people. So one of the tricks is, if you think about your brain as like, kind of computer, right? It's not, it's much, much more neat than that, but you already have the software program in your head for how to do compassion. What you haven't done is bridge that into the software programs in your mind about how to motivate yourself, how to think about yourself, how to define yourself, those kinds of things. So when you start to notice that you're getting more judgy and lacking compassion with yourself, think about that as a rumble strip on the side of the highway. It's a cue, a signpost of sorts for you to come back to using compassion. And then really just think about yourself from if I were doing this for my child, if I were doing this for one of my, coaching clients, how would I show up to this? What would compassion look like towards another person? So that's one way to do it. It works for some of us, not for some of us, because we have some real entrenched ideas about bringing out the whip for ourselves. And if that's the case, another little trick is get out a picture of you at a young age and look at that face and try not to have compassion for that face as you start thinking, because she's in there too, driving all of the ways that we do things. So those are some clinical tricks for how to kind of neurologically start to build new ways, new programming in our brain, but new neural pathways, new ways to think about ourselves. The next thing that starts to show up, so we have this big change, then we have all this insecurity because like, whoa, how do I do this? What am I doing with how am I navigating this? And that insecurity really starts to eat at us. Self-doubt, is a version of that. Self-critical thinking is a version of that. Self-judgment, comparison to others, all versions, all kind of cousins of this idea of insecurity in this realm. And if that's happening for any period of time, then we start to feel that sense of emptiness kind of move in. And I call it feeling emptiness, not depression. Depression is really a clinical disorder. It's very separate. There's a lot more that goes into that. But if you're a woman that has suffered with things like anxiety and depression, it certainly could be aggravating those mental health issues. So it may actually be more than just feeling empty, right? So I liken this to baby blues versus postpartum depression, right? There's a very different clinical basis. We all have a little baby blues because the oxytocin plummets after we give birth, but not all of us then develop a depressive disorder as a result of our postpartum state. And this is similar. Like all of us that go through a transition, we're going to have some feelings of emptiness if we're in that, insecurity for any period of time. But some of us also, in addition, have a proclivity towards depression. And so just be mindful of that. I'm always in my coaching, just because I am a clinical psychologist in practice, always trying to tell you where that line is and that you would want to access therapy if you feel like you've slipped into something that's a little bit deeper. But feelings of emptiness really are about, who I was for so long was defined by culture and defined by my family, and in some ways also, adopted by and or defined by myself. And I was all in on doing this thing. So to use myself as an example again, like I went into clinical psychology in, good God, well, 2000, I think, is when I started graduate school. So if you think about that, like this is, 22 years of my life, 22 years of my life, about 19 and a half, 20 of, it'll be 20 in the fall of clinical practice, because you start doing clinical practice almost immediately in graduate school. Most of what we learn in vivo. And I, in this last year, have really kind of been wrestling with stepping back as a clinical psychologist, like redefining it, because I still will do individual therapy, but making bigger some of these other areas of my business, like Learn to Love Your Story. And if I do that, I'm going to have to throw some money at that. There's a lot of risk involved in that, because anybody who's owned a small business knows there's just risk involved. You have a great idea, it could work, but whether or not it'll get lift, you don't know. And so you're going to have to bet on yourself. And so for sure, for me, this big change has brought up a ton of insecurity. And the feeling of emptiness that I think that I wrestle with is, was I putting too much time into this clinical psychologist role for too long? Should I have done this earlier? Which is not an uncommon way to frame that for women in midlife. So I'm 46 years old. Man, I had a lot more zest 10 years ago and one less kid. So it could have gone differently had I done this 1 decade in instead of 2 decades in, right? And that's normal for me to feel that. That's normal for me to kind of look at that and feel, it's not just insecurity, but to feel like maybe I should have done this sooner. Maybe I've missed it. Maybe I shouldn't, go crazy before the half-century mark. Like that might be a little silly. Knowing that about myself, I would say that in the places, so personalized liberation through awareness, compassion, empowerment, and self-care, that there are 2 things that are most important to this for me. One is awareness, because I have to know what it really is. I've also self-disclosed in a lot of the videos and things that I've done that I myself have struggled with depression off and on through my lifetime. Came out of a really chaotic family life as a child, not like a lot of other people. And that was one of the things that was kind of a residual leftover from that. And so I know the difference for me between feeling empty and starting to go down that road. So luckily, I'm a clinical psychologist with some self-awareness, so I can do that. But I would say that self-awareness is a super important thing, because I have to be able to name this as a normal part of this transition. It's a normal part of the development from one stage in your life into another stage in your life. You should have a feeling of emptiness, is kind of what I'm getting at. Like this is a natural stage in that. It's not a place to live. It's not a place to nest and get all ready to sit down in, but it is something that should occur to you. And again, one of the clinical ways that this happens is that we have patterns in our brain that pull us back into what we know, right? Our brain wants to work efficiently. And the way that it does that is it creates all of these patterns or habits for how we look at the world, think about the world, behave in the world, feel in the world, right? So if we have those habits set in our head and we start to push on the growth edge of that and say, oh, I want to do something that's not in the patterns, that's not in my Rolodex back there, then you're going to notice some of these predictable symptoms is really what it is. So feeling empty definitely is a part of that. And because I know that and I have self-awareness about that, that's the first step. The second step for me, however, And it's not always the case for everyone, but copious amounts of self-care. So when I'm under duress, essentially, like when my normal Natalie self is being put through a little bit more stress than normal, and this would be a little bit more stress than normal, my answer to that is more radical self-care. So what is self-care and what is awareness? This is a really, teasing these apart is really important. Awareness, of course, I usually frame as compassionate self-awareness, which is really those two tenets, right? So you can't just be aware about it, but you also have to show up kind and understanding towards it as well, like knowing it's just a facet of the growth process and not getting too bogged down into the fact that you're feeling this emptiness right now, or you're second guessing yourself might be a cousin of that, right? Like, oh, I shoulda, I woulda, I coulda. Having compassionate self-awareness is being able to look at that in a non-judgmental way. And I usually say, stay curious. It's a very easy way to stay non-judgmental. If you're curious about something, you want to know about it. You want to learn about it. You want to figure it out. It's a puzzle, right? It's not something to be judgmental towards and to say, this is why it's all bad, or this is why it's not working. It's a way of approaching things like with a child's eyes and saying, wonder why that showed up. Why am I feeling empty right at the time that I'm doing all these really exciting things and trying to get some lift in my career with this other stuff? That's interesting. You can come at it from that direction. You will learn why that's there, and you won't get so bogged into the inner mean girl that wants to judge it. And knowing counseling concepts and applying them in your own life can be tough sometimes. Always, right? They tell you not to diagnose or treat yourself. And it's why therapists need therapists. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, they do. 100,000%. That's why we need to have our own therapy.
So this led to more discussion about how one crafts self-awareness for themselves.
Yes. And you brought up like the essential component to that is meditation and mindfulness practice. And I know we all want to go, here goes the psychologist telling me to meditate again. Here's why you want to do this, because you didn't come to Coffee with Dr. Natalie not to have this be peppered with neurology. So this is your brain, right? Okay. This is the side view. This right here is right behind my forehead. This is the frontal lobe. If I could open that up, right? This little section here is the limbic system. And all you need to know about that is that's where all the feels come from. These are where all your feels come from. There's this place right here between the frontal lobe and that limbic system. It's kind of the connector between our thinking. We call it the executive functioning brain. That frontal lobe is like, how do we reason? How do we problem solve? How do we figure stuff out, right? That little piece right here is the orbital prefrontal cortex. And what that little bugger does is it's one of the only two places in our brain that can create self-soothing to the limbic system. If the limbic system takes over, it shuts off our frontal lobe. Fight or flight or freeze essentially is the limbic system saying the entire body mind is in danger. We have to stop thinking it through and problem solving and run the hell out of here, or fight our way out of here, or get so small and so still that the threat will go away, right? So if that's happening in your life when you're under stress, what you need is that frontal lobe to turn back on, and the conduit between getting all that reasoning back online and the part of you that's taking over in fight or flight or freeze is that orbital prefrontal cortex. Mindfulness practice and meditation is weightlifting for that part of your brain. So it literally builds the neurology. Like if they do PET scans, what they would see is that there's growth in activation in those areas over time. And sometimes that time is not even a lot. The University of Wisconsin, Dr. David, I'm forgetting his last name. Anyway, University of Wisconsin, he's done a lot of studies on the use of mindfulness and studied like Buddhist monks' brains and like just fascinating stuff like that. But we know to be true that sometimes it only takes 4 to 6 weeks to start to actually really get gains in that area of your brain. And so what that does is it stops the continual panicking mode or survival mode, and it brings back online that part of us that can distinguish, like you're asking. So can't name for you what that looks like exactly for you, but if you have this part of your brain online, the you-ness that does that will be able to do that. So mindfulness is key. Mindfulness and meditation is key to doing that weightlifting. So yes. And that is really when I do the online course or coaching, a great deal of it is talking about how to do mindfulness and meditation practice. And I start any of my programs with it because I want them to be doing it for the entirety of the program so that they can really get the value of what that does neurologically to change them. I'm going to go to the comments because it looks like I've had a couple. What about with someone with ADHD? I've tried to get into the practice. It's super difficult. Yes, it is. And it's not just difficult for people with ADHD. It's just difficult. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is this, it's not intuitive what the actual practice is. That's why I call it weightlifting. So I think what you're getting at with ADHD is your mind wanders. All of our minds wander. Somebody with ADHD, more so, right? At a level that's clinical, essentially, but all of our minds wander. I don't know what the statistics are, but like you have like 50 thoughts a minute or some craziness. It's like, this is like totally crazy. This is just our brain going all the time. So with ADHD or just with your mind wandering, that is actually, so it's like the mind wanders. And then once I notice it, I pull it back in. That's the weight lift. So if you did 60 seconds of mindfulness and your mind wandered 50 times, you did 50 reps. That's really what we're talking about. People have this idea that mindfulness is hitting the spot where you're all zen. Like, nope, that's not actually the practice. The practice to build the neurology is the pulling it back. So there goes my mind thinking about my grocery list. Let me bring it back. Oh, there goes my mind thinking about what I'm going to do today. Let me come back. And it's the comeback that is the actual rep that you're doing to build that neurology in the orbital prefrontal cortex. Mm-hmm. So that's also a very great question. I'm going to move into some self-care talk. So self-care, when you go to Google it, you get a lot of information about things you should do, like go to the salon and get your hair done or eat some chocolate or, maybe you'll get something kind of guidance wise, like take some time off from work, which actually can be a good one. Self-care, in my opinion, has little to nothing to do with the thing that you're doing, but everything to do with the intention behind it. Okay. It is about putting this vessel before all the other things in your life, which most of the time when I say this to women, they're like, and you've lost me. Like, I can't do that. I have kids. I have a job. I have this. I have these people all depending on me. Women in midlife often are stretching between aging parents, caring for them, and, coming of age children. Like everybody needs a piece of this, right? And so when am I going to have time to do that? My answer to you is this. That's true. That's been culturally normed. I get it. I know where you're coming from. I struggle with it myself. And there is nothing left of you to give when that goes away, unless you start with you. If your plan is always to fill yourself up, then you have enough and you're a better version of yourself as the, employee, as the spouse and all the things, the friend, the mom, all of those things. If you take care of this vessel first, then you have it in you to do these other things. Now, I break this down, if you've ever watched my other masterclasses, into a lot of different aspects, like things that shore us up. So boundaries are actually a form of self-care to keep our energy in, things that replenish us so that we build up more energy when we're choosing to expend it. So there's lots of different ways that I go with this, but essentially what I would like to just leave you with thinking here is it's not about the thing you're doing, and it has everything to do with the intention behind it. If it is meant to take care of this before everything else, then you're on the right track. Of course, there are things that help us make better boundaries and better, replenish us, and we can start to learn that about ourselves. But self-care is a very individual experience, and it changes across time. So another thing to be thinking in life transition time is, does this actually do that for me anymore? I used to think if I took a day off, that was enough. And I have learned, given the context of my career, I need at least a week. If I'm feeling kind of that burnout, I need at least 5 to 6 days in a row of not being responsible for other humans. That's literally what I do for a living. And to some extent, I my 7-year-old apparently cannot survive without me doing things for her. So I also am not able to phone that one in. Sometimes I am, though. Sometimes I will seriously take her to do an overnight at somebody's house, or just give myself a period of time, not even having to do that. But I've learned, like, what used to take me 24 hours now takes me a good 6 to 7 days. And I can sit and whine about that and be like, oh, I can't do it. That does not get me anywhere but more in my hole. So then it's going to take more and more and more and more time for me to rebound from that. So it is not uncommon for me to go, oh shit, like I can feel it. I need to know that I've got to take this time off, and I'll clear the calendar kind of last minute. I'm sure that all of my clients love me when I do that. But I also know that I come back a much better version of myself for all the things. So it's the right thing for me to do. Self-care is sometimes an uncomfortable decision to make, but it's the right decision to make. Any questions around that?
This led to a really great discussion about how women think of self-care as a selfish act, and how much guilt that they really have to push through in order to redefine this pattern in their life.
Women are in the middle of all sorts of ecosystems. Work ecosystems, family ecosystems, community ecosystems, religious ecosystem, whatever you want to say. Like, they are the caretakers. This is what we've gender rolled them to do. And, the feminist in me can want to, say, let's self-empowerment. We need to do a little bit more. We need to, break some of those constructs. But the realist in me is like, well, you put us here. So guess what happens if all those women get personally liberated? All the ecosystems that they're in benefit from that. And I don't know what that will look like, but I know that it'll look great, because if this is personally liberated, everything else within that ecosystem also is going to benefit from that. And I think that, not to get too out there in systemic kind of things, but I think that if we want to see some real change in the world, that this is a really great group of people to be focused on, to be honest. I think if we can lift this group of people, you're going to lift an entire culture. So just my 2 cents about that. So, I feel like this is my version of in my corner of the world influencing that. And I think if the ripple effects are really it could be great. It could be a really, really great thing. I think that in the 60s and when psychedelics were all over the place, there's a lot of theories now that entire generation of people kind of flipped where culture went. Because they were so counterculture, which is actually one of the facets of what happens when you take a psychedelic of any kind. I'm not going to get into this in great detail, but essentially it turns off a part of the brain we call the default mode network, which the best way I can describe this is it's the you-ness that's you. So if you turn off that, then you feel connected to everything, right? Like then the brain starts to see there's interconnectedness with all things. So with all of these young people doing a bunch of psychedelics during the 60s, there was a major shift in culture after that. Civil rights, women's movement, there was a lot of change after that. And I feel like personal liberation is a version of that. If I can break the default mode of who you think you're supposed to be as a woman in midlife, and you can enter into a version of yourself that you're choosing, which is empowerment in the PLACES acronym, man, sky's the limit. I have no idea what you'll do with that, but I know it'll be remarkable. That's my belief anyway. So that's why I think it's been nagging at me in this stage in my transition that I'm like, I need to do this. I have information that's useful, but not delivered enough in just the across the couch manner that I've had up until now as a clinical psychologist. So I want to keep a piece of that in my life, but I'm going to have to start writing and start speaking and doing some other things to get this information more infiltrated. So that's my plan. Yep. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on self-care before we move on to a lack of fulfillment, which is what can result when you sit in that feeling of emptiness for too long?
After this, we really broke down how if a woman doesn't do self-care, it really can start to compromise their bodies.
It will maintain that survival mode as long as it possibly can until it just can't, which usually is a function of either mental breakdown or physical breakdown or a combination of those. And so we get super sick in one capacity or another. But sometimes the way I'll describe it is like, either you're going to decide the uncomfortable decision of what's getting lopped off in your life, or your life's going to decide it for you. So it's happening either way. The canary in the coal mine has already started to tweet, but you can do it in a choice-based way, which is really what I'm talking about when I talk about empowered choices, or it will choose for you. And then you have that to kind of clean up in addition to coming back out of it in any way that feels personally liberating or even just baseline, I guess. And it's truly a tough thing. I love the insight that self-care needs can change, especially after life transitions. It's so obvious, and yet it's so hard to figure out how to identify how to meet those changing needs. Any suggestions on how you go about figuring that out? That also is part of that compassionate self-awareness. Why it's not a one and done, but when I teach people about places, what I'm teaching you is this is the core of who you should be. Always compassionately self-aware, always curious, always kind of waiting for something to come your way that says, change is in the air. And what does this mean for me? And what kind of things do I need to adjust? And then self-care really is what replenishes us as a vessel, right? It's what gives us the energy to be able to make some difficult or uncomfortable choices when we have to make those shifts. And empowered choice making is really a core piece of what you're talking about as well. So it's about breaking cultural norms. It's about breaking the definitions that you've been sold is a thing, and really questioning at a very core level, does this serve me? Because if it doesn't, okay, I'm just naming that it doesn't serve me anymore. Now I have to use my compassionate awareness to be curious in my life enough to see, is there something else that seems like it would serve me better? Try that for a while. And through my compassionate self-awareness and self-care, keep finding out, does that actually serve me? No, actually that thing that I did there, that wasn't the thing either. And you keep going. So these skills are really about keeping you in what psychology would call a growth mindset. So you're never staying static. You're always kind of pushing yourself on that growth edge. And what, some of the fascinating things we know about this is that neurologically, if you put yourself in that position, you're more resilient against like the kind of aging neurological deficits that can happen, like senility, Alzheimer's, those kinds of things, because you've taught your brain to always be in this space of not getting too lazy. And it's not that your brain's being lazy. It's actually supposed to get efficient. So it wants to create those habits all the time. But if you're always pushing against your habits, or at least staying in a growth awareness, like I'm doing the thing that I'm always doing, I see myself doing that, which is kind of a mindfulness way of showing up to it. Then at any point that it starts to shift, you would be compassionately self-aware of that. You might not do anything about it right then, but you would be compassionately self-aware of it so that you could keep kind of moving in the direction that you need to. But yeah, our needs change over time. Developmentally, our needs change, and self-care doesn't look the same. I think another thing that I grossly underestimated in my adulthood was the need for sleep, which is really fun because, I'm teaching people all the time that they should be doing it, but I thought I was a good 6 to 7 hour. I was like, I'm good. I'm good if I get a good 6 to 7 hours. Turns out that was not true, or at least not after about 35 for me. And so I'm a cranky ass bitch. Sorry to share my swearing, but like, I am not myself, like not myself at all when I don't get a good, honestly, 8 to 10 hours sleep, which is saying something, right? Because it cut in to the time in my day that I used to use as like productive time. I had to make a lot of changes in my life to be able to do that. And my daughter has really helped me with that because I wanted her to be sleeping with her little brain growing in the last 7.5 years. So I often will schedule our day in a very similar way where we're both winding down about the same time. And I go to bed within a half hour to an hour of her going to bed, if not at the same time. It just depends on what I know my body is telling me energetically. And she and I both are the same, very crabby. We have a very steep cliff when we hit that wall. Just a good time in this house. If it happens at the same time. But that was one of the ones that I had to be like, ooh, that's hard for me. It's an uncomfortable thing for me because now I'm lopping off hours that I used to see as productive time. So I'm, an online teacher. I was like, oh yeah, I'll just grade between like 8 and 10. Nope. Nobody wants me to grade them between 8 and 10. Let me just be real. Nobody wants to see what I come up with in that time frame. So easier for me to get up at 4 or 5 seems crazy because I hated mornings, trained myself to do mornings, but I used to hate mornings. And now what I've also known about myself is that there's ebbs and flows, obviously energetically for all of us. And for me, one of my most pristine times is first thing in the morning, which is another thing with self-care to think about is what do you do with that most pristine time? Because I would strongly encourage you to use the most pristine, energetic time in your day for your self-care, not for anything else or anybody else. Structure your day around taking that time for yourself. So for the most part, when I get up in the morning, I do like an hour of meditation, mindfulness, drinking coffee, like seriously just drink coffee and look out the window. And I guess that's a mindfulness activity. Sometimes I read, sometimes I journal, but it's a unstructured time that's just for me before anybody else is awake in the house. And so that's good. Yep. Great question. All righty. So if you're going through a big change, life transition, if that's leading to this insecurity, which it naturally should, and you start to notice those feelings of emptiness, but you kind of just let them go, what is going to happen is you're going to settle into this feeling of a lack of fulfillment in your life. Because even though your brain wants to go back to the familiar, you still have awareness that the familiar isn't enough, right? So lack of fulfillment is a bit of a canary in the coal mine, to use that metaphor again. It's a bit of a canary in the coal mine that, yeah, you should feel like this. You should feel like you have no fulfillment in your life because the life you're looking at is an old life that actually is not going to serve you transitioning into this new place. So instead of being at odds with this feeling of lack of fulfillment, again, I think if you can use some self-awareness, compassionate self-awareness about noticing it, what you'll know is, oh, okay, so now my body mind has called it. My body mind has called it and it's telling me either I make a shift or I'm going to feel like this, like maybe even start to get a little bit worse and more into some clinical depression. Next, on the 27th, we'll also talk about a sense of grief, which kind of is in paired with this, but grief is actually a normal, it's a normal thing to do anytime you're saying goodbye to one thing and hello to another. I wrote a blog about that this week, and it's uncomfortable, but it's a natural process if you let it be a natural process. If you resist it, then there's some junk that can come up with that. So I think that if you're noticing a lack of fulfillment, you've actually kind of hit a place where making empowered choices to step outside what you know and into what you don't know is the only way you will transcend through that part of the transition, right? So let's talk about that a little bit, because it's hard for me to such a big subject to talk about, like the constructs and social conditioning, and it's all of that stuff. Another way that I'll hear women talk about this, like in therapy or in coaching, is, man, I hit this point in my life where I was like, I should be happy. Like, all intents and purposes, if you look from the outside in, people think I'm happy. Like, I've got the house and I've got this and I've got the job and I've got all the things. I hate it. I don't feel fulfilled at all. Like, what am I doing wrong is kind of where they're at. And that's a good indication. Like, you should feel that way. What's right about feeling that? What's right about feeling that is that you're in a place where you're not satisfied with that life anymore. So you need to transition. You're going to need to start making some empowered choices that are uncomfortable, to break old constructs for what you should love and move into what you do love, what you choose for yourself, right? So any thoughts about that?
One of the topics that came up here was this concept of shoulding on ourselves, always pushing ourselves to a high standard.
You know, I try to stay in that non-judgmental, descriptive stance about things like this. But if you're shoulding on yourself, it's a great indication that there's a rumble strip and you've cued yourself that you need to be more compassionately self-aware. I have to understand a little bit more what I'm actually saying to myself. I'm saying I should like the life that I'm in, and I'm honoring that inside I'm being told I don't like the life I'm in. And instead of getting, doubling down and having my self-doubt and my self-criticism kind of push me back into my old habit, which is not aware, it's the opposite of awareness. I'm going to get compassionately self-aware about that and ask myself the series of questions around, well, like, what would feel good? What do I think would feel good? And if it's something crazy, like, you shouldn't be a psychologist 35, 40 hours a week, you should probably go start this learn to love your story thing. You might not like that. Like, I was not happy. I was like, bitch, I just got to the place where I know what my income is and I know how to handle these things, but it wasn't going to be enough. It just was not going to be enough. And I love my job. And as I, said earlier, I just feel a calling that there's some information here that is not in popular culture that I think needs to be infiltrated into the culture. So that's an example of making an empowered choice. Started purposely doing self-care a few times a week about a month ago, just started to feel the feelings that have been suppressed for many years. So the other thing is, when you start to take care of you, the you that stopped talking to you because she was never getting heard starts to talk a little bit more again, right? Mm-hmm. So once behavior is our first language. This is what I think I've written blogs about this, but I just love this about self-care. Self-care is talking in your first language. If you care for you, then you start to feel heard and seen in your own life. Your behavior of caring for yourself starts to tell you you're being heard and seen in your own life. Then what inevitably happens is a little bit of the actual meaning behind that starts to bubble to the surface. So you start talking to yourself about, there's some things that I've been pushing away that I did not want to see that are showing up. And that's okay. Compassionate self-awareness also helps that. Just be kind, just be understanding that, of course, I pushed that all away. I had to get through what I got through. Like, my body, mind knew to be in survival mode up until now. I guess I didn't have the skill sets yet that I was going to need to really look at this and be, in my own tolerance level and my own emotional bandwidth able to handle it. That's okay. That's fine. Now it's here. Now I must have those things, and let me sit with that and see if we can move through this. And here's another place. So we were talking about don't should on yourself. Stay curious when you use the word need, because need is very much integrated into these cultural constructs about ourselves. So I need to put my kids first. I need to make sure that I honor my responsibilities. These are the ways that we use that word. And it's sometimes so, like, it's a habit, right? It's so ingrained in how we talk about things that's another rumble strip. Just the word itself. And it might be spot on, but it also might be all kinds of wrapped into these cultural constructs and social constructs and your own personal constructs for yourself. So what do I want? I'm always a little bit more curious about what do I want? Like ideally, what would I want? Jen Hatmaker, who I mentioned earlier, I know that I've heard. So Jen Hatmaker, because these are all these people that are at that level, is like besties with Brene Brown. Wouldn't we all love for Brene Brown to come over to our house when our marriage is failing? But that was what happened. And one of the things that Brene told Jen was, you are going to take care of your body. Like first and foremost through all of this, you need to eat well, only things that are nutritious. You need to be drinking a ton of water. You need to be sleeping. You need to be not having alcohol right now. Like not that you can't in your future, but like you need to take care of that body of yours. Like it's the only thing that you're assigned right now. And she actually attributes that to being one of the main reasons that she was able to get through those initial, months or whatever after things imploded in her life. And it's not wrong. Like what you're saying is not wrong. And you have health conditions that also kind of wrap up into that. But I would say, again, it goes back to that idea of the self-care and that our bodies, our body mind's first language is behavior. So if what we do first before anything else is to put ourselves first in whatever capacity that is, taking care of your body or whatnot, that's a strong message to us. That's a strong, strong message. Another Jeff Warren, acceptance does not mean approval. Absolutely. But acceptance of what is happening and welcome to the party have helped me with feeling the feels when they surface. It totally does. It totally does. Another one that I like is Tara Brach. Will tell you somatically kind of put your hand on your chest so that it has some weight to it, like pressing, and just say, this belongs here. So whatever that crazy reaction you're having, the shoulding on yourself, the I need to, I should be happy about my life, whatever that is, just press and say, this belongs here, because it belongs there too. Like it's a programmed response that you've taught yourself to have for years and years and years, showing up when you're testing the growth edge of your boundary, when you're pushing past what you know for life, familiar wise, into what you choose, what you in an empowered way want for your life and are ready to, take a risk on this one right here to transcend that. I hope that this was helpful and you enjoyed it. I hope you join me again on the 27th so we can go through the next 4 of these, which are inadequacy, regret, feeling like our future isn't really bright, and a sense of grief, and where all of those play a part in major midlife transitions or changes of any kind for people. So thank you all for joining me. Keep following me. I've got another group coaching group that will be starting in October. It will be the very last group that I do at the price point that I have listed on my website, 2023. I'm adding a group that's a group for people who have graduated from my groups. So there will be a different program along with the Learn to Love Your Story curriculum. And we'll be calling that Liberate Your Joy. That's the Liberate Your Joy program. And in doing so, I'm kind of restructuring some of those things. I think some of you may, if you follow me on social media, see that I am trying to get an app built, which is scary as hell and very expensive. But I think will be a better, what's I think going to be nice is there'll be, like this free version of it that has the community where I can send all those things out, those messages that I do every week, but it's all in one place and it'll automatically push notify you when I've sent out one of those things. And so it's more of a closed group of people that really can start to facilitate sharing, just like you did today. Like there is something brilliant about sitting with a group of women and just hashing some things out that we've all been feeling. And I want to create that space in a more closed way than FacePage, which is not my favorite. All right. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your weekend.